Hey everybody, we are officially live. I'm so excited to dive into another pre-symposium panel as we lead up to our executive symposium in Houston on October 17th on the topic, how to maximize our team's potential. So if you're watching this and you're a leader and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I could get myself to Houston on October 17th from 5 to 8 p.m., you should come to our executive symposium. I'll post in the comments on this chat and on this video for how to RSVP. But we've got three great guest panelists with us here today to talk about the topic, who will also actually be at the executive symposium. So if you're like, oh my gosh, I'd love to meet Brent, or I'd love to meet Christine, or I'd love to meet Victoria, you can. And so what we're here to talk about is how to maximize our team's potential. So my fellow panelists, can you all introduce yourselves before we get started? Brent, do you mind going first?
Don't mind. Good morning. Thank you for having us. I'm Brent Brightwell. I'm actually live in Austin, Texas, although I used to live in Houston. I travel there often, have some wonderful family there. I am a marketing product startup consultant. I've been doing that since I left Hewlett Packard back in 2014. I love working with the ankle biters, the early stage, the ones that are going to take off someday, that people the underdogs. Uh, so yeah, happy to be here.
Very cool. Christine, how about you?
Christine Zapata, and I am a human resource consultant. I've been in human resources for 30 years, mostly in service. I've got some global experience as well, so different cultures and different ways of work is very interesting to me. I'm based in Houston, Texas, so we got another Texas person here. And started my business recently and just team up with companies to see what we can do to make their processes more effective.
Very cool. And Victoria, how about you?
Yes, I am also based in Houston, Texas, and I lead two companies. Kevin Mitch Group is a technology consulting firm, and the other one is Touchpoint, which is a career development company where we support and motivate career professionals. I am passionate about this topic, quite excited to jump into the conversation, maximizing team potential. And it's one thing that we are passionate about at Touchpoint. So really glad to be here. Thank you, Karen.
Of course, of course. And I'm Garrett Mintz. I'm the founder of Ambition in Motion. At Ambition in Motion, our vision is a world where the vast majority of people are excited to go to work. When they are there, their expectations meet reality. When they come home, they feel fulfilled. And we believe that starts with leaders, because leaders create the experiences employees have while at work. And so we create communities to empower people to be their best selves for their teams. And one of the ways we build community is through our executive symposiums. So let's dive into the topic, how to maximize our team's potential. So one thing I've seen a lot lately as the economy is shifting and things are zhuzhing and iterating is a lot of companies are doing what we might call wide-scale layoffs, laying people off. And ultimately, I think that there are missed opportunities, especially as it pertains to maximizing our team's potential. I think perhaps maybe when these companies first made these hiring decisions or brought on these new departments, they had these visions of grandeur of like, oh my gosh, if we develop this department, this can mean X for our revenue, or minimizing these Y expenses on our cost and bottom line, or whatever it might be. And for one reason or another, whether it be those individuals' fault or not their fault and just poor planning, unfortunately, they were laid off, ripped the full Band-Aid off, and they're left wondering, what the heck am I doing? Or, was I bad, or was I not a good employee? And I think that there's a lot of missed opportunities from the C-suite perspective in terms of tapping into what we might consider high performers, especially if that company lays off an entire one department over here and then puts out a job rec a week later for an entire different part of the company over there. It's like, oh my gosh, could you have leveraged some of those people that were in one department to another? So to kick us off, I'd love to ask, what have you found to be effective? Have you identified any companies that you found to effectively maximize teams' potential, especially if they determined that an experiment that they were running, whether hiring or building up a new department, didn't work out? Because, by the way, all experiments is our hypothesis. If we knew the answer to the end goal, it would be easy and everyone would be doing it. We run experiments. Sometimes they knock it out of the park. Sometimes they do average, and sometimes they don't work out. How have you seen companies effectively deploy experiments, and when they determine that they're wrong, maximize the talent of those that are on that team to run a different experiment or go through? I'd be curious to learn if you found any companies that do a really good job of that and what they do to be effective. Who wants to go first?
I would let me attempt. Okay. So in terms of companies, I wouldn't want to call out names. But I have heard some companies, their policy is to retain as much as possible their team, their talent, and give them opportunities to grow by going for opportunities in other areas that they were not hired into. So they understand the currency of trust. See, Garrett, trust is not something that it's only important for companies in trying to project their brand to the public, but it's a currency that I think has much eroded over time between employees and employer. And because of that trust, that mistrust, um, employers are in there with their focus on, okay, my employer is not looking out for me. I need to look out for myself. And what that does is it creates a culture, which is the culture we see today. People talk about toxic work cultures. People talk about cultures where they are frankly not motivated to work. They're basically working to meet their bills, or just waiting for the next best opportunity. And then there's also the element of generational changes. So we see in the Gen Zs and maybe even the millennial generation, they don't have that same loyalty spirit that the baby boomers or Gen Xs may have had, because of what they have seen over time as erosion of trust.
I'll jump in. I worked, Garrett, good question, because I've worked for a large publicly traded manufacturing company, and there were departments and resources and ways that when there was an upcoming cutback of staff, they had the volume to look in other departments and see if there's a fit. The challenge are the small to mid-sized companies where, especially the small companies, you've got subject matter experts. So your engineer can't be an accountant. So it's more challenging for those small companies. And so the goal is to take a step back. And what are you putting in place to motivate your employees before a layoff has to take place? Salary is one of the most expenses, highest expenses a company has. And what can you do to maximize profitability, minimize chaos in your workforce to where you can avoid the layoffs? Because again, these smaller companies, moving people around really isn't an option.
Good point. Yeah, I mean, I hope that there are companies out there that aren't running experiments that are taking people's jobs, right? People have mortgages and got to put kids through college, and experiments are terrible ideas when it comes to people's career. Because when you take a person's job, you're taking their livelihood, and it's part of you is killing them. You're taking something very important from them. They worked very hard to get there. But I did work for a company called BMC Software based in Houston, Texas. And a friend of mine, Tom Bishop, was a CTO, a former Tivoli CTO, brought me in, and he eventually introduced me to Bob Beecham, the CEO. And he was mentoring me at one time. And he had a book, what he called his rock star book. He threw it down in front of me. I opened it up and looked in there, and he said, "These are my rock stars." So, okay, it seems, why can't they be pop stars, country stars? But he said, "I have to go to the board if any of these folks right here are leaving or consider leaving or at risk, flight risk, and explain to them what we're doing to keep them or what we try to do and couldn't do." And that notion of having what he called key employees that were engaged, that were so important to the business that we just can't lose them, or my job might be on that. So yeah, there are companies out there that are very considerate of who they have to keep and those they think they don't have to keep, which is often a fallacy, because when we do lay off people, the people we thought we wanted to keep sometimes look around and go, "Wait a second, I'm not happy here. They just cut Brent loose. I think I'm going to go work for the competition." And that happens a lot. So that forced attrition comes from some of that planned attrition, and that could be unintended consequences that can happen.
Brent, would you mind me taking this step one step further?
Please.
And I think companies, and Christine, I think you can even speak to this, companies wait until pretty much the last moment to intervene when an employee is about to leave. But there have been indices, there have been signs, there have been factors that may have played, and we're already feeling antsy and uncomfortable, and they're demotivated. But by the time they make it known they're ready to leave, their heart is already out of the door. One of the things I had proposed is why couldn't we use data, HR analytics, to study and understand what are the factors that will prevent, what are the factors that would indicate when an employee is unhappy or demotivated and is looking at leaving, or what demographics or groups or areas in the company do we see the most attrition from, so that HR can be more proactive rather than reactive.
I like this. These are really interesting points. I love all that. I mean, y'all have brought up really great points that I want to get to, but I do have a point of disagreement. It'll start with Brent. I think it's okay for companies to experiment. I think as long as you effectively communicate, that's something that's the most important part, because if we don't experiment, we're never innovating. We don't try something new. If we don't say, like, if we don't allow, like, experiments are like Google's 10% time. If we don't allow for 10% time to happen, Google Maps doesn't occur, Gmail doesn't occur. A lot of like the cool, innovative new things that come out of companies where they say, hey, we're going to allocate this much for you to work on these sorts of things. So then you could see if you can create something new or innovative. But I think what companies really struggle with, and this is kind of to Victoria's point of companies being really reactive, I think companies wait till the last moment for a lot of things, not just waiting to see if someone's disgruntled and about to leave. I think companies wait until the last moment to pull the trigger. In terms of like ripping off the band and saying, hey, we're going to lay off 100 people and this is just how it's going to work. I think a lot of companies aren't proactive about communicating. This is the experiment we run. Unfortunately, we need to hit profitability. We need to hit XYZ metrics or numbers by this date. If we don't hit those numbers as a group, we're going to need to reevaluate. And therefore, we're going to have 2 months to reevaluate the way that we structure that. And in 2 months, if we're not able to hit those numbers, we might have to make a wide scale change. I think most companies are afraid to communicate that because they are fearful that if they share what the experiment is, that people won't even engage or won't even join it.
Or they may know that if it fails, the outcome can impact their career. And we don't, let's be sure, but we want to experiment and try things on products and innovation and to stretch and grow. But the point is, do we want to experiment on people's careers, their livelihood, their child's future? That's probably not the best place to do your experimentation and talk about it to the workforce, because they're going to see it as an experiment and see that they're the lab rats, and they're going to go find a new maze to go run around.
Maybe, I mean, or they get excited about it. Maybe they say like, hey, I like this as a new challenge. I want to go.
There's a financial incentive. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. And, but I think the challenge most companies run into is the transparency. That's the part I think most companies are not good at, is saying, hey, this is an experimental role. We're giving this a shot for the next 12 months. If we're not able to hit these numbers, we won't be able to continue doing this because it'll be a money pit and we can't just keep spending money in this area. And like, be upfront with people and like, it's your risk. But if it works, you could be the SVP of this entire entity of the organization. So it's like a very high risk, high reward, but you let people know, as opposed to telling people like, hey, this is a very safe role. This is something that's very stable. And yeah, I don't know. That's my take on the experiment.
It's like a labor attorney's, dream to know if a company something like that.
Yeah.
We're just waiting for them to screw up.
Into something, sorry, Victoria said, and Garrett, it's a good point of different generations, different mindsets. And as a good leader, you want to key in on those differences. So Brent, for you, that experiment may be uncomfortable, but for me, I'm all for it. And I'm willing to take the risk. So we don't want to assume it's a bad idea, because to others, that's a great opportunity for them to grow. And what I've seen companies do, though, is, and Garrett, you hit it, don't spend 6, 8, 12 months letting people hang out there doing a poor job or not being successful. Create those timelines. But I've seen companies, I worked for Stanley Black & Decker, and they had a fallback. we're going to try this. If it doesn't work, you can go back to your role. And they kept that role open because you're right. People, it's very difficult to say, I'm going to try this for 3 months. And what if I'm out of a job? You're not going to get anybody to do it, in my opinion. But you are going to find people who are willing, if there is some kind of fallback or a little bit of safety, to say, you know, we need you here. And then, very important, don't choose people for the team. They need to choose themselves. You do not force somebody, hey, I think you'd be good at this, so you're now on this team.
That's a great
Not,
idea.
yeah, that's not effective. So
You become a volunteer versus a victim. With
Right.
experienced control groups, so in those larger companies, you can maybe have your control group
Yeah.
over here that's a little bit based, and you could fall back or roll back to, versus one that's going to take on the risk and go
Right.
try something new.
Yes.
That's actually
But the challenge is when the whole company is chaotic, when there's constantly sandboxes here, and you acquire this piece of business, and then 2 years time you're selling it, and then next year you're reorganizing the company, and then 2 years time you're shuffling people, and then you're laying off, and then you're hiring, and you're laying off, and you're hiring. And so what that generates is a chaotic culture.
yeah.
I like Lou Platt's approach to when it came to layoffs. He was the last internally promoted CEO of HP. He would start with the leader who put together the program that was leading to the layoffs, and so he had no problem with doing layoffs. So he started with the executive, the CXO was the first one to be laid off, right?
Oh, that's interesting.
Interesting.
That's a cool story. No, a lot of accountability, because you're right. There are definitely a lot of companies where, the CEO realizes, oh, geez, we hired for this department. It went south. We're gonna have to just lay off all these people. I'm still getting my bonus, but like,
Someone
we gotta make
convinced
cuts in other areas.
or
Just
her to go do that.
my area. But no, that's a really good point. But Christine, you bring up this really good point of don't choose people for especially new and kind of like newfound teams or departments that are being stood up or ramped up. Let them choose, because I think you bring up this great point about things that you can train and things that you can train. If someone's voluntold to do something, what kind of engagement are they going to come into this new role or this new position versus letting them choose and say, I actively want this because this is something I'm engaged with. You can train skills. You cannot train passion, right? What are your thoughts on that?
That's spot on. I jumped to the sales industry or sales profession. I can't remember the name of the company, but we did personality assessments, and we tied it back to the job and any job, but sales particularly. And you get somebody in there in the interview and they're talking the game and they're great. And I had one to do the assessment, and no sales skills, no sales passion. They were just there talking the talk. But when we did that assessment, and you cannot put somebody in a role that they're not good at, it's a failure. And so, like I said, assessments are great, or, just making sure that you're holding somebody accountable to the tasks. And, Garrett, that's perfect. Passion. Do they have passion for those tasks?
It's a good point. It goes back to those old days in school when we saw the great test takers, right? Wow, he must be really smart, but he couldn't walk through a door without bumping him. It was just kind of fumbled through it. Forrest Gumped his way through life, but man, he was really good at testing. Must be really smart. It's just not, it's a very good point, Christine. Appreciate that.
So when we talk about these companies that you mentioned, they're very reactive to scenarios. Victoria, you brought up the point before about how companies, when they notice someone might be disgruntled or about to leave, they're too late to the game. They're jumping in way too late to jump in and try to re-engage someone. Or if they then realize the CFO hasn't been looking at the numbers for the last 3 months and is like, oh my gosh, we've been spending how much money on this? Oh my gosh, we got to rip that off. No more. Get rid of that whole department. Is this why is this happening? I guess the question is it because companies are so tactical? They're like, their head is so far into the sand where they're just like doing their day-to-day running of whatever tasks are on their plate, that they don't look up for strategic reasons and are like, oh my gosh, this is not heading in the direction I thought we were, or I wasn't paying attention. Like, why do you think that's going on? I don't know. I'd be curious.
So one of the things I really enjoyed when I did my doctorate in strategic leadership and innovation is the difference between transactional leadership and transformational leaders. So I see that most often leadership we see are transactional in nature. So they are relying on rewards, they are relying on corrective action to achieve organizational goals, right? As opposed to leaders who are transformational, leaders who are strategic. So they understand that what they have most over their followers or the team is influence and helping them to have this connected vision of the goal. And that is what drives motivation in leadership. So you're not reactive, right? And what that breeds is
Uh-oh.
that
We
breeds
may have lost our volume.
I mean, I've lost my volume.
Oh no, I got it. I was gonna say
Yeah.
you sound good to me.
Yes. And so what we see even at the lower levels of organization is that um, leaders become bosses. They become directive in nature, right? They want the team to look up to them. But what would really maximize potential in teams is when you have self-managed teams, where you have a participatory leadership style. You hired people as experts for a reason, right? Not to tell them what to do, but to pool their experience in making the vision or goal happen.
Yeah, with well said. With publicly traded companies, it's very hard for leaders to have more than a quarter by quarter strategic plan and stick with it. They're very tactical because they've got to report and have at least 3 months visibility of what's going on in their business. So it doesn't leave time for a lot of strategic long-term things because they may not hit their numbers, may not be around for very long. So it's a lot of pressure, incredible amount of pressure on these individuals. They have to make time to be strategic and they have to think through that. If they are reacting, you'll see the behaviors that Victoria mentioned. They're out buying new companies to drive revenues or to get talent or buy innovation that wasn't invested in R&D because it was cut, years before, and now they need to go and expand and grow in new markets. And react, they want their investors to believe that they know what they're doing and they're competent and they're trustworthy, but they have to do this, make all these changes. Some of them on purpose create chaotic environments. There's a whole rationale behind chaos and opportunities and companies who do that, leaders who do that. They're doing that to maintain their position because they operate great in chaos and it stops anyone from challenging them. I've seen that in my career many times where CEOs create chaotic environment. They buy a new company every 18 to 24 months. That company comes in almost like they bought them and the leadership takes over and it turns over. Right. So you can't get past a strategic plan more than, if every 18 months you're bringing in a whole new leadership team and changing things up, but it allows that CEO to keep their job for quite a while. Because they're motivated to look out for themselves too.
I wanted to tie into something Victoria said. A company, my most recent company that I worked for before I started my firm, operated in chaos. They turned over their CEO once a year. It was a foreign-owned company who didn't understand the US. So I saw it really firsthand as their vice president of human resources. And we talked all the time about we're trying to change the tire on the bus while it's driving. And so Garrett, to answer that is, why are they reactive? When you're in a growth mode or a change mode or transition, you don't have time to be strategic. Well, you have to make the time, but companies are like, it's just too chaotic. We've had turnover. We've got a new book we've got to read, a new idea. And, you've got to have that consistency and Victoria, like I said, you hit it. You got to quiet that chaos to go from reactive to proactive. But in 30 years, I have found very few companies that are absolutely proactive. You've got people doing 3 jobs. They're very busy, from leaders down to front line. And we've got to change that mindset. It's a mindset shift of you have to be strategic. You can't just look 2-3 months and then look up at your financials, like you said, Garrett, and go, oh my gosh, profitability's down, now we got to lay off people. So we have to shift. You got too many companies that are operating in that chaos.
Well, you bring up this really interesting point about international companies, and even, Brent, your point about just quarter by quarter public companies. And there's just this notion of short-term mindsets. I mean, I know a lot of Korean-owned companies, they run their executive team on 3-year contracts. So you get 3 years. And so at the end of 3 years, you're either moved to a different part of the company, or you're let go and you got to go find yourself in another business. And so what ends up happening is if they look at a strategic initiative that they know is going to cost them money, going to maybe take a little bit of a dip to then get up to profitability. But by the time they hit the profitability numbers, it'll be past when their contract's up. There's no incentive to do that. Why take the losses? Why show that on the books? They're like, hey, let's kick that can down the curb, and some other CEO will jump in and maybe take on this initiative, because it doesn't make any sense for those CEOs or those executive teams to take on that expenditure when they know that the rewards of taking on that expenditure won't come until after they're gone.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, Brent, if you wouldn't mind me interjecting, I think that's why this needs to begin from the board level. The board needs to set that expectation for the executives so that they are not thinking short term. What is the performance contract, the performance metrics that they're measured on? If they are short term metrics, then you can't blame them for being reactive. But then if you cascade it down to the lower levels of organization, as a team leader, what kind of performance metrics do you have for your team? Are you rewarding competition, or are you rewarding cooperation? Because when teams work together to meet a goal, they can exceed that, to lengths. But when teams everyone is for himself, you're rewarding individual contributors, people become competitive, and they focus on their individual contribution, and you do not experience the potential the team could have achieved.
We incent the behaviors that we want to see in others, and we role model those behaviors as well. So when you do have that 3 years, you should be able to come up with a strategy and tactics that are going to yield the outcomes that you're looking for. Just like on the quarter by quarter, if we're incenting them on that. My first foray into corporate world was my dad was working for Eastman Kodak. And in the late 80s, early 90s, they were very much incenting the behaviors for their executive team and their CEO to cut costs and become more efficient after the big merger between Eastman and Kodak. And that CEO at the time ended up laying off about 3,000 people, my dad included, impacted our family significantly. And he ended up getting like a $30 million bonus. Right. So think about 30 million in 1990, what that looked like today. And the stock market rewarded him, his investors rewarded him, and he went on to have a nice life where that 30 million could have funded those 3,000 people for quite a while. It just was a transfer of massive wealth from one to the other. But that's how he was incentivized. Can I blame him? Do we blame him? We don't like it. It sounds horrible, but that was the reality of his situation. He made of course, the sociopathic choice to think about himself and not others. But we incentivized him to do that. We, the board, we, the stock market, we, the investors, and then all those employees were investors, right?
Oh, fortunate.
Yeah, so this is you bring up this interesting point about incentives, and I think that's something we should touch on, because I do think companies struggle with that. I think you see some companies that just say blanket, everyone gets their 3 to 5% raise every year, and no questions asked. It's between 3 and 5%. So you're getting that same thing over and over again. What incentive do you have to grow? What incentive do you have to work hard? You got an incentive in that model to do just enough not to get fired, because you're going to get that 3 to 5% every single year. And after a couple of years, maybe you switch roles to get an elevated position, a little pay bump, and then maybe you boomerang back, or you go to some other role, and you kind of run that same cycle. It seems like that's where the incentives are in place. I've started seeing some companies get more progressive by adding in different performance-based metrics and performance-based incentives, especially at the senior leadership level. But sometimes what I'll see is those incentives are flawed. So, for example, one of the leaders in our executive mastermind group leads software for a Fortune 500 company. His boss, the CTO, is directly incentivized every 2 weeks to put out a new feature or update to their software, regardless of whether the customer is asking for it. And the idea was, well, if we're incentivizing our tech executive to put out new software every 2 weeks, we'll always be ahead of the times. We won't rest on our laurels. We'll always be up to date. But the overwhelming feedback that we're getting was, stop making new updates. I like the software how it is. You're, killing me with all these new updates. I don't need a software update. Please stop it. And so our leaders, the head of software, is like, well, what do we do? My CTO is telling me that we gotta push new software updates out because he's not going to get his bonus at the end of the year because he's directly tied to it. And it was a flawed approach because they're not listening to their customers. They're just doing it because some board member did that. So what is your suggestion for companies if they determine that a incentive was good in nature initially, but flawed in execution?
Garrett, can I challenge what you said?
Yeah, please. Challenge what I said. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So let's go to the sports world. And I'm not a sports, expert by no stretch of the imagination. But when the San Francisco 49ers played against the Kansas City Chiefs, right, at the Super Bowl this year, what was the incentive for the teams? Did each of the player have an individual incentive, or did they have an incentive as a team?
They have both team incentives, but also there are individual. Like, it is funny, like when you watch podcasts, you'll be like Rob Gronkowski is like, yeah, Tom Brady had to hit me with this one pass because then I could get my 100th catch for the season, which gives me a $2 million pay bump on my compensation for the year. And so they purposely did that, even though it would be garbage time and the game was over. But yes, for the most part, teams are incentivized to win the Super Bowl and perform the best they possibly can.
Right. So that means that the individual incentives did not come in any way interfere or counteract the team incentive. The team incentive was clear.
Sure.
Right. And I think we could pull that same parallel into the corporate world.
I agree. I totally agree. Yeah, I don't disagree at all.
But I challenge that.
Yeah, please.
I do. Well, yes, team incentives are great. I think as long as you built the right team, as a leader, your job is not to make your team blend to you, but you are to blend to the team. And team incentives, I think, are great. But what about your hypos compared to the just slipping by? And so in sports, going back to the sports analogy, you do have your high potentials that you can then additionally incentivize because, even at annual increase time, your matrix, if they're a high performer, they get a bigger increase. And it's very much set. If you rate this, you get this, but you still have to pull out your high potentials. You don't want to disengage them by saying, well, I got the same bonus as the person next to me, and he or she just really didn't perform and I did. So you've got to be very careful about dynamics or you're going to disengage your high potentials.
Right. So at the end of the day, you have to have both.
Yeah.
But one doesn't harm the other. And I think what we have today, there's a difference between a team and a group. And I think most of the teams we see are really groups. Many of them haven't gone through the stage of teaming where, the Tuckman 5 stages, the forming, the norming, the storming, the forming, the storming, the norming, and the performing, right? And when you have highly performing team, you have individuals who understand the value they bring to the team. And what that does is that checks social loafing, right? It checks people who are there, who are just barely pulling their weight, but trying to take advantage of the performance of the team. But yes, you're absolutely right, Christine. It's important to reward the high performance, but because I think most of the way we approach teaming is performance management conversations, performance contract conversations. It's more from an individual point of view where we empower or we tend to foster competition rather than cohesiveness and cooperation.
Yeah, and you want to kind of, like you said, there are those that are there to get fat, dumb, and happy, and then those that are hungry and they want to drive and go forward. And sometimes that changes. And that 3-5% you mentioned, Garrett, kind of does the fat, dumb, and happy and the big incentives and rewards and the accolades or the Super Bowl ring, right? That comes with that big win. Now, I do think we have to differentiate between a knowledge-based workforce, right? People that are using their brains to produce IP and value, like the biggest companies in the world that are doing now, versus more of a physical labor or a factory floor or what you used to call non-thinking person's job. I think Bill and Dave at HP did it very well. They said the strategy. Here's our strategy. X marks the spot. This is where we're going. They're very clear in their strategy. And then they said, we're going to get out of the way because we've hired all these smart leaders, smart people in this knowledge-based economy, right? They essentially built the Silicon Valley and the VC community and management by walking around, the 5-minute manager and all these great things over the years. We're going to get out of their way and let them drive and come to us if we have obstacles, and we'll help you along the way. But they made sure they cascaded those communications to those leaders who were able to cascade those communications down to their teams. And they were able to align what the leadership team for financial outcomes, growth, whatever it may be, to the individual contributors. And they incentivized behaviors, whether it be not just financial behaviors, but they gave them the level of, here's what our purpose here is at HB. And this is what our strategy is. And here's your level of autonomy. That's what a knowledge-based worker needs. They need that autonomy to go make decisions, right? And to be feel empowered. The relatedness, getting people to be able to understand how their contribution fits into the bigger picture. So they had a very good, they were the type of leaders who really understood the difference between engagement and engaging, the rational versus the emotional, because they were dealing with a much higher IQ, EQ workforce. Which are often very difficult to manage and to keep and to retain and to grow because they go off and start their own businesses. Encourage as well.
This is really interesting because the thing that I keep thinking about in my head is these concept of incentives. Victoria, you're talking about the concept of team incentives. Christine, you brought up the idea of individual incentives. And by the way, I think, Christine, that aligns, your concept of individual incentives aligns with Victoria's concept of being a proactive employer, because if we're giving everyone the same 3 to 5%, what if I see John Doe, who's been slacking off and not doing nearly as much work as I am, getting the same pay, same bonus, same everything as me? That's not that incentivizing. I want a company that's proactive, that's going to compensate me. But the thing that I keep running around in my head is this concept of transparency and communication. It keeps, I don't know, for whatever reason, it keeps coming back to that, because let's say I lead recruiting for my company and my incentive is that I fill job recs within 30 days of them being posted. Well, if the company's not doing that great, we're not going to have nearly as many job recs. So I might be hitting all my goals, stamp, stamp, stamp. I hit my goals 100%. I'm killing it. I look great. And then all of a sudden the company turns around and says, hey, we're going to have to slash our entire recruiting department because we're just not recruiting that well. And you look to yourself, you're like, well, I knocked my numbers out of the park. How could I, be a part of it? And so, one part of me thinks okay, we've got the helpless. I'm part of this department that's got nothing to do with sales or operational efficiency. So therefore I'm over here. I can't possibly help. Another part of me says, or thinks, okay, well, the C-suite team could be transparent about what's going on in the business. And when the job recs are diminishing, we got to be open and transparent to our recruiting team. Hey, can you be helpful in other parts of the business? Because right now you aren't needed as much to recruit, but we might need you for sales, or we might need you for operational help or effectiveness. And can you be a team player to help us get there? Because it gets back to the whole Victoria component of hey, if I'm on a football team, let's say I was hired to do special teams. Well, if the starter gets injured, someone's got to play linebacker. And you know what? That might be me. And even though I was hired to do special teams, I might have to come in and play linebacker because the current starter got injured and they need someone to step in. So the question is, it goes back to how can companies better deploy people in departments that are not being as utilized to other departments to help save the day, or at least get them involved in the solution? Yeah, that question makes sense.
Go ahead, Brent.
Well, I think if it's not happening and it's chaotic and you've got all these challenges against you, you have to mandate it. You have to force it down because it's the right thing to do for the company. People don't like mandates, but it's very important to offer those and make those available to everyone. But Christine, go ahead.
Well, mandates. I love it, Brent. I hate that word.
Yeah.
I really do.
Mandate, we're fixing to do a major layoff to the software group, but we have
Yes.
job openings in the hardware group. Are any of those skills transferable? And should we put preferences on those individuals who can be impacted by this change? and give them an opportunity before we start go out and post the rec. A lot of times they do have to post the rec for legal reasons for a period of time, but we're going to give preferences to internal people that are already here.
What I was going to say with a mandate, it works if you have leaders, not managers. You have leaders in the organization who, Garrett, can do that transparency to say, this is the reality. This is how our business is. A lot of my clients today are not doing as well financially. So it's hard to go to them to say, we're going to pay incentives. There's no money for incentives. So what keeps those employees there? What keeps those employees engaged when you do put that mandate? And that's really where that leadership skill comes in, because people, most people will resign because of their manager. So if you don't have money for incentives, but you still have to give incentives because you're about to give a mandate that we're about to operate this way, you better have some strong leaders in that organization who can talk about it and help people understand the why.
Yeah, I love that. I think that concept of helping people understanding the why and having leaders that can do that is critical. I mean, the word that just screams out to me is vulnerability, of just saying like, hey, we're in a position where unfortunately things aren't working out the way we were hoping for. The economy's taken a downward trend, and at this current pace, things may not be working out, and we might not be able to keep as many people in XYZ department. But we've got at least 3 more months. So we can keep you in this department and you can keep doing what you're doing. Or there are other opportunities to help out in, Brent's concept, software to hardware, or there's other ways to help out with customer success to sales, or recruiting to sales or operations. I don't know. Like, there are other ways that you can get involved to help the business turn things around and help things get better. I think companies are afraid to share that vulnerability because they think, oh, well, if I share this vulnerability, then everybody's going to leave and no one's going to want to work here. And very well, that might be the case, but it is the right thing to do. Like, because ultimately, if you rip the Band-Aid off and then you tell people that they're laid off, I would argue that that's more unethical than just saying, hey, here's a chance for you to help us, like, pick things back up and be a part of the solution, versus you just not being a part of the solution and, just getting laid off and you're SOL.
I think Christine was spot on. I mean, did we hire leaders or do we have managers, and do we understand who's which, right? Because with managers, they're focused on engagement, right? The rational commitment that goes on, right? They're driven by processes and systems and metrics and analysis. They're focused on the compensation and operating model, and they're probably using quantitative measures, where an engaging leader is the emotional commitment. They're driven by behaviors and values. They're talking about the culture. They're talking about, they're authentic in their leadership, and these are all intrinsic motivators. And those who can understand how to match the engagement with the engaging part, a good manager and a leader, usually have a pretty good engaged workforce that's loyal to them and loyal maybe to the logo, right? Maybe it may change a few times, but that's what you're looking for to be able to lead these changes during times of stress and duress.
And I think we see that more in small organizations. Because if you have a small organization, the leader is often the organizational structure, it may be flat, and so he's more connected to the team. And so there's a tendency to see more transparency when they get to those points in their journey, and they are able to convince the staff to transcend their self-interests, right, towards this, to make through this stage or this phase of the organization. And they're able to give people the opportunity to, shift in terms of take parallel roles, to be able to keep them, because they want to keep that knowledge. They want to keep that team, that cohesiveness. And that's where you see less attrition. But I think with the big organizations, what happens is, organizations begin and there's this idealism, right? And then as time goes on, people become vested in the organization, but they become vested in keeping the status quo. So whenever there are any, changes, there's a tendency to, no, let's not communicate that, because then we lose people. But you lose people when you don't communicate that, because what you do is that you lose trust. People want to know what's going on, and how can, you can even, how can I help? How, you can pull on the talent and the those trust strings to be able to help the organization through those difficult phases. But unfortunately, that's not what often happens with the bigger organizations.
Awesome. Well, Brent, Christine, Victoria, this has been a great pre-symposium panel. This has been a really engaging dialogue and discussion. If you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, man, I'd love to meet these three great leaders and come to the Executive Symposium, you should. I'll post the link to RSVP for the Executive Symposium on October 17th in Houston on the topic, how to maximize their team's potential, in the comment section for this video. But anyways, thank you all for being here, and audience, thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you at our next